This week from the global lane. After his State of the Union address, Democrats said President Trump failed to reach across the aisle. Our government is polarized, some say even paralyzed. Is Congress pushing us to the brink? Is American democracy nearing an end? Campus Reform's Hannah Sherlocker will join us to set us straight about masculinity on college campuses. Is it time for men to stop being men? She'll also tell us about the professor who told pro-lifers to just sit down and shut up. America goes to pot. It's nothing new. The nation has a long history of marijuana use, and it's not just millennials who are now pushing marijuana legalization. And our man on the street, Mengfei, asks people what they think about marijuana in America. Should it be legalized? And I'll drive it home with a look at the current state of the American Union. Is Armageddon coming, or God's blessings? And it's all right here, right now, from the global lane. On the home front, with all the dissension in our society today, is America at risk of losing our democracy? Do younger Americans really understand what democracy is all about? Do they even care? Well, joining us is Stephen Levitsky. He's author of the newly released book, How Democracies Die. Mr. Levitsky, so how do democracies die?
Well, they die in different ways. There are many ways to die. But increasingly, whereas in the old days, back during the Cold War and much of the 20th century, democracies died at the hands of men with guns. They died through military coups. And since the end of the Cold War, the last quarter century or so, it's been much more common that democracies die at the hands of elected leaders themselves, elected presidents or prime ministers who use the very institutions of democracy to undermine it, which is, go ahead.
Well, I was going to ask that. So are we in America seeing that happen? Is American democracy on the edge of death?
No. American democracy is quite robust, maybe not quite as robust as we sometimes assume, but I don't think that American democracy is either dead or dying. What I do think is that we need to stop taking its survival for granted and look at a few warning signs on the horizon.
Well, what are those warning signs?
Couple of things. We've got a brilliant Constitution, but constitutions only work when they're reinforced by a couple of unwritten rules or what we call democratic norms. Two of them are particularly important. One of them is what we call mutual toleration, which means that both parties, whatever the main parties in our democracy are, have to accept each other as legitimate, have to accept both privately and publicly that the other side, we may disagree with them, we may even dislike them, but we understand that they are patriotic Americans, they love the country, they love the Constitution, and we may not like it when they win an election, but it's okay. The second one is what we call forbearance, which is exercising restraint in the use of power. And what we have, the troubling conclusion that Daniel Ziblatt, my co-author, and I have reached is that in the last 25, 30 years, those two unwritten rules of democracy, those two norms, which were strong throughout the 20th century, are starting to weaken.
Well, I want to know also what your experience is with young Americans. Do they really understand democracy and what it is? Why or why not?
Well, I mean, historically, younger people often are not as engaged with the democratic process as older people are. It's as we go through life, we tend to become more committed to democratic institutions. So certainly surveys show some worrying signs among the young in terms of their interest in politics and their commitment to democracy. But that is partly just a question of age. But one thing that is worth worrying about is that Americans have a tendency to take our democracy for granted, to believe that no matter what we do with it, no matter how irresponsibly or recklessly we may behave, that of course our democracy will survive. And I think the World War II generation knew better than that. But generation, as we grow increasingly distant, and we're actually quite a distance from World War II, I think there's a tendency to just simply take the survival of our democracy for granted, and that's a big mistake.
Yeah, a lot of those from the greatest generation are dying off, and do we remember what they did and their sacrifice? Now, in his State of the Union address, President Trump suggested that his administration is putting America front and center on the world stage. So is our democracy still a good example to the world, or have we lost respect?
I think we've lost respect. It's very difficult. The United States has always proudly promoted democracy abroad. We've done so for more than a century, and we've done so quite effectively throughout much of our history. Certainly in the 1990s, first under Reagan, then under Bush, then under Clinton, the U.S. was a major promoter of democracy abroad, which I think is a good thing. But it's very difficult for our country to promote democracy abroad, to tell others elsewhere that they ought to adopt democratic institutions when our president has been calling into question the very legitimacy of our electoral process, saying that our own elections are rigged, are fraudulent, saying that our own press is conspiring against the government and is an enemy of the people. That kind of language suggests that we don't have as much credibility promoting democracy abroad as we used to.
It seems that our politicians in Washington are more interested in advancing the interests of their parties over the interests of the people. So what needs to be done to preserve our democracy?
That's a great question, and that's the big question. I think I would have a better paying job if I had the answer. We need to find a way to overcome polarization. Our two parties, as you just mentioned, are intensely polarized and are increasingly, as you mentioned, putting party before country and even putting party before our democracy. So the first thing we need to be aware of, or our politicians need to be aware of, is that if they continue to behave this recklessly, we could lose our democracy. Our constitutional system could fall into crisis, which would hurt all of us, all Americans, on all sides of the political spectrum. And what we all need to do is find ways to bridge the differences, what have become enormous differences between the two parties. We need to find a way to find common ground, and at the very least, to speak to one another and begin to rebuild respect for one another. Because our democracy cannot work if the two parties don't have a minimum of respect and acceptance of one another.
It's a little like a marriage, isn't it? When two
Absolutely.
Actually become one.
Yes.
You compromise. You don't always get your own way. Well, Stephen
Absolutely.
Levitsky, what a wonderful book, author of How Democracies Die. We thank you for sharing your insights today.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure.
American society is facing greater pressures from the left to redefine masculinity. A new movie just out called 12 Strong received some criticism from journalist Peter Maas, who tweeted, "It's time to wage war against war movies that glorify outdated models of masculinity." And on campus at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, a student-led project is targeting culturally defined and toxic masculinity in hopes of reducing sexual violence on campus. Well, joining us now to talk about this and other developments on some American college campuses is Hannah Sherlocker, program manager and opinion writer at Campus Reform. Good to see you again, Hannah. So tell us more about this redefining of masculinity at the University of Tennessee.
So this student group to deconstruct masculinity is just the latest example of the war on masculinity that we see all the time at the Leadership Institute's Campus Reform on college campuses all over. Duke University this semester is launching a 9-week program dedicated to destabilizing toxic masculinity on campus. And we see hundreds and thousands of dollars, student fee dollars and taxpayer dollars, poured into courses, workshops, and programs aimed to strip men of their masculinity.
And these aren't liberal campuses. I mean, Duke and also Knoxville, University of Tennessee. I mean, you'd expect them maybe at Michigan, Ohio State, Madison, Wisconsin.
It's just absurd. The same movement that seeks to promote equality and empowerment for women is the same group that is telling men that the very core of their identity is flawed. Men and women were created differently with complementing different features and gender roles. This should be embraced. We shouldn't be seeing one gender as the enemy and one as the positive one. This is a failure in society to treat it as such. You know, a functioning and healthy society embraces the difference in gender roles. College campuses need to stop this anti-male rhetoric, or we can only expect a society where we see more broken homes and broken families.
And as people are mourning and dealing with tragedy, I know last November, after that Texas church shooting, a professor at Kutztown University blamed toxic masculinity, not mental instability, for that massacre. So why this cultural war on men being men? Your thoughts?
Well, lamenting toxic masculinity is not empowering for women. It's a way for some women to blame all men for the mistakes of a few. There is nothing flawed about the core and identity of men. You know, denying masculinity and denying manhood deprives men of their unique role as protectors and providers in society. Without that, it leaves men out in the cold questioning, who am I? We need to stop stripping men of their identity and start embracing the differences between men and women. This has to start on our college campuses if we want to see a productive and functioning society in the future.
Hannah, the cultural war is also against women who take a stance for values, and more recently, those who march for life. Tell us about that.
So a professor at the New School sent out a series of tweets essentially telling all women who attended the March for Life to sit down and shut up. This is the opposite of women's empowerment. You know, this professor is essentially saying, if you don't think exactly the same way I do, then sit down and shut up. You are unworthy of being part of the conversation and incapable of thinking for yourself. This is the opposite of women's empowerment. When I think of women's empowerment, I think of President Trump's cabinet with more women elected to high-ranking positions than ever before in history. I think of women who attended the March for Life, who marched on behalf of the voiceless and the vulnerable. What I don't think about are those who claim to champion the rights of all women, except for those who are pro-life or conservative.
And I'm sure you and millions of other women were offended by that. And Hannah, 1 week before President Trump's State of the Union address, your colleague, Cabot Phillips, asked students at NYU what they thought of the president's speech. Again, this was before the State of the Union speech was delivered. Here's a shortened version of that.
What was your reaction to everything that was said?
I didn't watch it because I couldn't bring myself to watch it.
Quite racist at the very least, if not up there with most racist.
Yeah. Wow. It's almost already quickly climbing the scale. Some of the people said today that they thought his immigration stance and that he outlined last night was especially hateful.
Very offensive.
What do you think of it?
It's something that I wouldn't have expected to happen in, like, our lifetime.
It's offensive. It is crazy, but I'm not shocked by it, by what he's done in the past, so.
Pretty ugly. I believe what I'm hearing about his rough nature and the hate that he probably said.
He told the Democrats the wall got 10 feet higher because they didn't stand up and give him applause at one point. What do you think of all that?
It's the behavior of someone who refuses to accept accountability for their failures.
The way he acts, you shouldn't be acting like that if you're the leader of the country, regardless of what party you're in. So that frustrates me a lot.
I mean, it doesn't surprise me that was his State of the Union address.
Hopefully everything that he's outlined can be overturned by the public opinion.
Again, Hannah, that was 1 week before the State of the Union. Were you surprised by this? What does it say about students on campus in 2018?
Unfortunately, I was not surprised by this at all. Ironically, liberals pride themselves on being open-minded, but many of them are so quick to form their opinions before learning anything about the topic. And what's most outrageous about this is that college students at some of the top universities and colleges in the nation have no idea what or when the State of the Union address is. The State of the Union is probably one of the most important events of the entire year, where the president lays out our priorities for the future and the current state of our nation. But instead of learning important things like this, students are learning about toxic masculinity and feminist dance theory. So this is just the result of the echo chamber mentality we're seeing on so many college campuses.
Okay, Hannah Sherlocker, we appreciate you keeping them honest and exposing all this. And it's always good to catch up with you and the latest craziness on American college campuses. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
In the past 5 years, 30 states and the District of Columbia enacted laws to decriminalize or legalize marijuana for medicinal or recreational use. A 2017 Gallup poll found that 64% of Americans believe marijuana should be legal nationwide. More and more millennials say marijuana use is their constitutional right, and the government should keep its hands off their pot. Well, here to set us straight on this is Emily Dufton. She's a historian from Washington, D.C., where pot is legal. She's author of the book Grassroots, The Rise and Fall and Rise of Marijuana in America. Ms. Dufton, thanks for joining us. So has the marijuana debate settled down a bit, or is it still a big issue of contention in our society?
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here. As for your question, I would say that no, the marijuana debate is very much still going on. Now we have 9 states in D.C. that have legalized, but on January 4th, Attorney General Jeff Sessions actually revoked the Obama administration's Cole memo. The Cole memo said that state legalization laws could stand. The Attorney General Sessions' sort of revocation of that suggested that there's renewed federal interest in pursuing marijuana crimes. And that means that even though more and more states are legalizing, the federal government is actually continuing to pursue and one might say punish or legislate marijuana Schedule I standing.
So I guess there'd have to be some legislation then from Congress. But some young people believe that marijuana represents more than just a product. It symbolizes individual freedom in this country. And are they taking it a bit too far with that view?
Ironically, they're actually mimicking or mirroring the same view that young people have had about marijuana since the 1960s. Beyond millennials advocating for legalization today, there's actually sort of the residual baby boomers who are still using marijuana. They're the ones who are really pushing for legalization as well. They find that using medical cannabis helps them with their problems with persistent pain or nausea or anything else, sort of the trials and tribulations of getting older. So from the very beginning, when people were emphasizing their right to access marijuana as an element of, one might even say, libertarian freedom, you see the same thing happening now with pretty much the same people who were protesting for it in the 1960s. It just continued.
Now, did you take a look back at like the 20s and 30s, 1920s and 30s, and what happened then?
Marijuana was actually being used in pretty much the 19th century. It would come in tinctures that were sold in corner pharmacies. But after the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act, an element of the progressive era, they had to be labeled. People were very aware of what was going in them, and marijuana was not as readily accessible in the sort of pharmaceutical areas anymore.
How are the attitudes of politicians different today?
Well, I think marijuana's 22-year history as a medical substance has influenced a lot of people. But unfortunately, because of marijuana's Schedule I standing, it's really hard to actually do sufficient medical research to really understand what this drug is.
Well, how should the public then be better informed on it in a fair way, especially when you look at the health risks without political influence?
It's tough, right? It's tough to find really good information. But one of the things that state legalization laws got right was that they enforce new regulations, that the marijuana you buy in dispensaries has to be free of mold, free of pesticides, free of any other sort of outside contaminants. We do need more research into what marijuana does to the human body. And in that sense, although it would take a very long time, it might not be unwise to move marijuana schedule to potentially Schedule II or III, which would increase access to it for medical research.
And of course, health risks as people smoke and inhale into their lungs. I'm sure there are greater health costs and a lot of cases of people with bronchitis and upper respiratory problems. So, Emily Dufton, I appreciate you. You're a historian and author of the latest book, Grassroots, The Rise and Fall and Rise of Marijuana in America. Very interesting to look at it from a historical perspective. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
What's your view on marijuana?
Legalize it. Yeah, I've never gotten in trouble back when I used to smoke cannabis sativa, but I travel a lot around the country, and it seems like the places I travel to, the people are a lot nicer, a lot more chill. So,
I'm back and forth on it. I haven't really seen a lot myself as far as proof to say that it's completely dangerous or anything like that. But also, as someone who has Tourette syndrome, I've read into some reports about using it in children for Tourette's, and I've been intrigued by that. I'm back, like I said, I'm back and forth on it.
I believe that it definitely has medical purposes, and I feel like it would be something that could definitely be legalized for that. I'm originally from Massachusetts, and I know they just legalized it up there, so I don't have a problem with it personally. I think that it's fine if it gets legalized. So it's not heroin, it's not cocaine, it's not a strong drug like that.
What's your view on marijuana?
What is my view? Well, me, I say it more of a help. I think it's more helpful than harmful. And
do you think we should legalize it? Because Virginia is not right now. Do you think we should legalize it?
yes, I do. Yes, I do. Very.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
Marijuana. For those that don't mind smoking it, power to them.
Do you think we should legalize it in Virginia?
It's one of those things, it's a catch-22. You know what I mean? There are enough people smoking it anyway, legal or not. You know, if you're going to smoke it, at least do it legally.
All right, thank you.
I don't know. I don't really care if other people do it so much. I think the research has shown there's, like Sanjay Gupta talked about it, and he said that it doesn't affect brain development after the age of 25, but there's signs that it does affect before then.
Well, do you think we should legalize it?
I really don't have any opinions on it whatsoever. I guess if you tax it and use that money for something good, then it makes sense, but I don't really have strong opinions either way.
What's your view on marijuana?
That's the best thing in the world. That's what keeps everybody together for real.
Okay. So you think we should definitely legalize it?
Yeah, it decreased the crime rate. The best thing. Because when people don't smoke, people is aggravated because the stress of the world. Yeah, so more people that smoke, less crime. Hey, vote for that.
Oh, man. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Marijuana. I don't know. I think it has a lot of good health benefits. I've seen it help with epilepsy as a recreational drug. I don't know. Honestly, I don't do it. I don't smoke. So, I mean, I know other people do, but I couldn't really tell you because I've never tried it. But I think it definitely does help in a lot of ways with health and cancer patients, and it can relieve a lot of pain and stress as well.
Do you think Virginia we should legalize it?
It's a tough question. I really don't know. I feel like I would have to really think about that.
While the State of the Union is a time for American presidents to take pride in listing their annual accomplishments, it's also time for them to set the agenda for the year to come. President Trump's first State of the Union address was an ambitious and optimistic vision for America's future. So let's take a look at how America's doing 1 month into the new year. Despite the divisive politics of Washington and the gloom and doom and negativity that we're hearing, the State of the Union is pretty good, and it's getting better. On the economic front, housing starts are up 3.3%. Single-family home construction has surged to its highest level in 10 years. And there's good news for sellers. Home prices are up 6.2% over a year ago. Nancy Pelosi called the Republican tax cut Armageddon. But since its passage, companies like Comcast, Bank of America, AT&T, and American Airlines have announced they're giving $1,000 bonuses to their employees. Again, Negative Nancy says those are just crumbs. Well, it may not be much to her, and I wouldn't expect it to be, because she's one of the wealthiest members of the House of Representatives with a net worth of just under $30 million. But to an American family earning about $50,000 per year, only about $33,000 after taxes, it's a nice chunk of change. It could be used to pay off credit card debt, make some much-needed repairs to a house or automobile, or it could help pay for a long overdue vacation. Also, companies like Wells Fargo, Boeing, Comcast, and Walmart say they're raising the minimum wage for their employees. Walmart says it's raising the starting wage to $11 per hour. Now, that might not seem like much to Negative Nancy, but I talked to a Walmart cashier who told me he makes $9 an hour. $11 an hour means another $250 per month for him. He said he may quit his other part-time job and go back to college. And because the corporate tax rate has been slashed to 21%, some big companies have also pledged to invest billions of dollars in America. Listen to what the president said about Apple.
Apple has just announced it plans to invest a total of $350 billion in America and hire another 20,000 workers.
As companies invest in new plants and upgrade their factories, jobs will be created. Wages will likely rise because of shortages in the labor force. It's called competition, Nancy. And everyone, not just the wealthy like you, benefit. More people working means more people spending and investing and paying taxes. That will lead to an expanding economy. The employment rate is now down to 4.1%. That's a point below the full employment level. Unemployment among African Americans is now at 6.8%. Still high, but that's the lowest ever recorded. U.S. consumer confidence is at the highest level since 2001. And the stock market, well, it's at a record high and ended 2017 up more than 5,000 points for the year. That was its biggest single-year gain in the Dow's 121-year history. And this year, the United States is expected to overtake Saudi Arabia and Russia to become the world's largest oil producer. Also on the domestic front, when the final stats come in for 2017, they'll likely show the rate for overall crime, violent crime, and murder in America's top 30 cities fell 2.7% over 2016. And overseas, our efforts fighting terrorism are paying off. In late December, the Pentagon said ISIS controlled only 1,900 square miles of territory, and that's down from the 17,500 square miles the group held during the Obama administration. And the number of ISIS fighters in Iraq and Syria have been reduced from a high of 35,000 in 2014 down to less than 1,000 today. Yes, the Iran nuclear deal is still alive, but it's hanging by a thread, and the Ayatollah now knows America means business. New sanctions were imposed on Russia for meddling in the 2016 election, at least for their social media ads, propaganda, and media leaks. North Korean missiles remain a threat, but Kim Jong-un made nice with South Korea, at least for the Winter Olympics. And with China, the country Trump calls a strategic competitor, $250 billion in trade deals were firmed up. In Israel, Jerusalem is now off the table in future peace talks with the Palestinians. The Israeli capital is non-negotiable. U.S. aid to the Palestinian Authority was reduced. There's pressure on the Palestinians, even coming from Europe, to eliminate monthly cash payments to the families of those killed, injured, or imprisoned for killing or attacking Jews. Yes, the State of the Union is good. I believe the future is bright, not because of American politicians, but because God is blessing our nation, and the blessings will continue. But there's a caveat. Moses tells us in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 28, verse 1, if you fully obey the Lord your God and carefully follow all his commands that I give you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations on earth. You know, it's as simple as that. Obedience to the one who gives us breath and life. Well, that's it from the Global Lane for this week. Catch us on Facebook, SoundCloud, iTunes, YouTube, and Twitter. And until next time, be blessed.